All right, hello everyone. Welcome. I'm having a look at the chat to see that we have people coming from, we have someone from the Netherlands, from Mexico, all around the country. All right, we'll get started. So hello everyone and welcome to tonight's In Dialogue program, where each month the National Portrait Gallery collaborates with colleagues from across the Smithsonian to explore issues of social justice through the unique objects in our collections. Our intention is to provide a space where we can have a meaningful and critical conversation about art, history, and material culture, and think about how objects from our collections speak to today's social justice issues. My name is Vanessa Jones, and I'm an educator at the National Portrait Gallery, and I've had the pleasure of collaborating with colleagues from the National Museum of the American Indian to present today's topic. Before we continue, I would like to note that this program is being transcribed by a live captioner. So if you would like to enable or disable the captions, toggle over the CC or closed caption button at the bottom of your Zoom window. I'd also like to note that this program is being recorded, and I will now pass it over to my colleague at the National Museum of American Indian so she can introduce herself.
Thank you, Vanessa. I'm happy to be here this early evening with you all, and I'm excited to see how many people are joining from all different parts of the U.S. and other areas. My name is Mandy Van Hoofland, and I'm Minikoju Lakota, and I'm a member of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe, which is located in South Dakota. And I manage the Cultural Interpreter Program at the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian. I've been with the museum for the past 12 years. And again, I'm just really happy to be here in conversation about our objects. And before we go any further, I'm gonna hand it over to Kaya Black to talk more about our community norms during this webinar.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Kaya Black. I work on special projects and programs for the National Portrait Gallery. I will be moderating the chat this evening. Before we delve into the program, I would like to go over the community norms. And they are to respect others and their opinions, consider your own privacy and that of others, think before you hit the send button. Cyberbullying will not be tolerated. Speak for yourself and not as the representative of any group. I also would like to mention that we will use the chat for comments this evening and to please put questions into the Q&A. We'll have time for Q&A with the panelists at the end of tonight's program.
Thank you, Kaya. We really appreciate you sharing those community norms, and we look forward to engaging with our audience during this program. And before we get started, I do want to gratefully acknowledge the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home here today. And we have some information if you're interested in learning more about land acknowledgements from the National Museum of the American Indian. And also, just want to address probably one of the most common questions that we get at the National Museum of the American Indian, which is about the correct terminology that we use to describe Indigenous peoples or Native peoples. So you will hear the words American Indian, Indian, Native American, Native, Indigenous, all throughout the course of this program. And this is, like I said, one of the most common questions we get is what is the correct term to use? And it's a really difficult question to answer because of the diversity of Indigenous communities that live throughout the Western Hemisphere. each individual has different preference for which overarching term they might prefer. And we just have a few tips or things to keep in mind if you're thinking about this. We always want to avoid generalizations and use conditional language. So you won't ever hear me say all Native people feel or all Native people think, because it's impossible for, I think, anyone to make that statement. We also always want to use present tense and contemporary examples of Indigenous peoples so that we don't relegate Indigenous people or cultures to the past, and refrain from using terminology and phrases that perpetuate stereotypes. And the best thing you can do is ask an individual what term they prefer to use. There's so many different ways that people might prefer to identify themselves. Many people choose to identify with their specific tribal community or culture, just as I did when I introduced myself. So just wanted to share that, since it's one of the most common questions we get. And we do have more information about the impact of words and tips for using appropriate terminology, again, on our museum's website. And as we get going here, we are framing today's conversation around one overarching question. And that question is, what is the connection between a desire for recognition of one's culture and activism for equity? So we're going to be thinking more deeply about this question and exploring these topics through some close looking at two objects from each of our museum's collections. So one object from the National Museum of the American Indian and one object from the National Portrait Gallery. And I'm going to start with sharing the object from the National Museum of the American Indian that we'll be talking about today, which is a uniform that comes from a boarding school. So to begin, I want to ask the audience to just take a moment to look closely at this object, and in the chat, share what stands out to you about this object. What do you notice most? And you can go ahead and add your responses in the chat feature. So we're going to take a moment for those comments to come in. All right, so it looks like we're getting quite a few comments in the chat. Kaya, would you mind sharing what some of those comments and audience answers are?
Sure, Mandy. So a lot of people commented on the military style of the uniform. People noted how rigid it appeared to be, that it more likely has been made for a man or a male. One particular comment mentioned that it erases cultural identity or markers of cultural identity. Very polished looking. Some people did take note of the embroidery shape on the uniform. I'm trying to see. Yeah, a marching band appears. It looks similar to a marching band uniform. I'm trying to see if I see anything else. I think that's about it. Oh, someone did mention that it seems to have American colors, which is an interesting kind of perspective here. And I think that's about it.
Awesome, thank you for scrolling through those comments for me, Kaya. Yeah, I definitely agree with a lot of the comments made. It does look, very militaristic in nature. Very interesting comment about the colors. I hadn't quite thought of that before. And the idea that it could be used for cultural erasure. So I want to direct another question to Vanessa this time. And just wondering if this is what you would expect a school uniform to look like.
Definitely not. Especially, I think, if we're thinking about contemporary children. Yeah, it definitely looks very militaristic, as people commented, and also very adult-like. It's not something you would expect a child to wear, and nor does it look very comfortable.
Yeah, I heard, or I think I saw one of the comments or that, it's kind of rigid um, and stiff. And thinking about, the nature of this uniform, what, what is the purpose of school uniforms? When you think about it generally.
Well, typically, they are meant to make everyone appear alike. So they are meant to, in a sense, erase where someone comes from. Today we think about uniforms as being a way to equalize children, particularly socioeconomically. And a uniform is typically in line with the philosophy of the school, right? Whether it's a more progressive school or often more traditional schools tend to use uniforms nowadays.
Hmm. Yeah, it might say something too about, if the school is religious in nature, the uniform might reflect that. Yeah, definitely. Those are all things that I think about when I think about school uniforms. And I want to talk a little bit more about, the background of this particular school uniform. And to understand more about these Indian boarding schools and where they, how they came to be, I'll talk a little bit more about the era in which this history unfolded. In the late 1800s, the U.S. government had enacted new policies towards American Indians, and these were known as civilization regulations. And the whole idea was that forced assimilation of Native peoples into mainstream white society or Euro-American society cost less it costs less for the government to civilize Native people than to kill them or to go to war with them. And so the government at this time in that late 1870s established a set of what were called Indian offenses. And these were actual like laws and policies that Native people could be tried in court and jailed for violating. And those Indian offenses included things like practicing traditional religion or ceremony. For example, ceremonial dancing was banned. Partaking in other types of ceremonies, in Lakota culture, the giveaway ceremony is a really important part of our social lives, and it's done at births, at deaths, during specific points in people's lives. And so those kinds of things were outlawed and banned, and it was a way to get Native people to conform or to become civilized, and that term was used quite a bit. It was the opposite of savagery, and those terms kind of carried almost like propaganda qualities with them. And for Native people who didn't adhere to those rules, they were given harsh punishments. And the policies were initially aimed at adults in the communities. However, they didn't really stop, adults from continuing to live their and practice their cultures. It didn't stop them from speaking their language or participating in ceremony. Things may have been hidden from view, but people were continuing to pass on those traditions. So because these laws and regulations weren't as effective as the government had intended them to be, the focus then turned from adults to children. And There's one person, Richard Henry Pratt, who became one of the most prominent Indian educators in the late 1800s. And he was actually responsible for the creation of the first boarding school, federally government operated boarding school, which was called the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. And it was located in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. It opened in 1879. At the time, Pratt was considered a progressive reformer and believed that it was essential to get Indian children away from their families and their tribal nations in order to prevent parents from raising the children in their own cultures. And so reformers like him founded boarding schools where children could be isolated from their native language, their values, and traditions. They were, saw themselves as well-meaning advocates of American Indians, and they believed at the time that the modern world had no place for Native peoples or their traditions, that they must assimilate. Sort of the motto of Carlisle was, kill the Indian, save the man. And cultural erasure was the stated goal of boarding schools. The Carlisle boarding school used military discipline, uniforms such as this, hierarchy, and conformity to train children in non-Indian culture. So at Carlisle, they taught reading, writing, Christianity, and other vocational skills like farming and trades for boys and sewing and cooking for girls. And when children arrived, they were given Christian names. They were banned from speaking their language. Their hair was cut and their clothes were taken, and they were provided a uniform like this. And the uniform in and of itself was designed to reinforce assimilation. So I want to take a closer look at one of the details on this uniform. This is one of the brass buttons. And if you look closely, which I know it might be hard to see depending on which device you're joining from, what the detail of this button is an image of a farmer and a plow, and the words, "God helps those who help themselves." So I just want to ask the audience another question here. How do you see this small detail reinforcing the assimilation policies I was just talking about? So you can go ahead and post your responses in the chat. All right, so I'm seeing some comments coming in here. Kaya, would you mind sharing some of the responses we've gotten so far?
Sure. Let's see here. As I scroll down, let's see. Shows a relationship to the land that is characteristic of Eurocentric American culture, farming and building on land. Also, let's see, it says, making it sound like the fact that Native Americans had suffered because they hadn't put effort into helping themselves, reinforces the message of Christianity and reminds the wearer of this every time that they attach this button, that one is responsible for their own success. Someone mentioned community collective support is denigrated. Again, someone made reference to the idea of cultural erasure, which was mentioned earlier. It's a very, again, religion is coming up again in relation to Christianity, but it's very Protestant Christian value connecting work and religious virtue.
Those are
let's see
a
if
lot
there's
of really great responses. I think definitely getting at, you know, the um, the point of paying such close attention, you know, to the detail of something like this on the uniform, the button, to reinforce all of those ideas. So thank you to the audience for sharing that, and thank you, Kaya, for summarizing those audience responses for me. So yeah, everything, you know, everyone was pointing out there was really right on. I kind of heard, you know, it reinforces these Eurocentric ideas of, you know, what prosperity meant or was supposed to look like, the sense of almost individualism as opposed to community, which is really integral in Indigenous life. You see that horse and the plow, which really was this almost definition of what civilized society looked like at the time. You know, there's a particular way of working the land, you know, plowing the land, that symbolized that civilization. I noticed in the background there's what to me looks like a sod house, and which is again another symbol of using the land in the way that American society viewed it as prosperous at the time, as opposed to, you know, a lot of tribes across the Great Plains, you know, lived in teepees. And so it's this movement away from that lifestyle into a sedentary lifestyle. So there's so many different ways that this button is reinforcing those views of assimilation and what the civilized version of living looked like. The motto itself, you know, reinforces that Christianity and the kinds of work and skills that were being taught at the school. So just to share a little bit more with you about this uniform, I wanted to talk about the person it belonged to. So we actually know some of the history behind this exact object. It was worn by an Osage boy, and his name was George Connor. He wore this uniform while he was a student at Carlisle. He was born on the Osage Reservation in Kansas in 1870 and attended Carlisle Indian School two different times between 1885 and 1889. And during his last years at Carlisle, he assisted with the physical education of fellow students and coaching younger boys in baseball and other athletics. He also participated in something that Carlisle called their outing program, which placed Native students in neighboring Pennsylvania farms in the summertime. So that's where I think they also learned a lot of the farming and working skills that the school was trying to teach. And Carlisle itself closed to students in 1918, but we know that its legacy impacted each student differently, and it shaped their lives and even the lives of future generations. Many students experienced painful loss. You know, some students did not survive that boarding school experience, and others who did use those experiences to advocate for change. So now I'm going to turn it over to Vanessa to talk more about a Native woman named Zincala-Šá and about how these policies of forced assimilation and cultural erasure shaped her life.
Thank you, Mandy. That was really, really interesting. So yeah, we're gonna switch gears a little bit now, and we're going to take a look at this portrait from our collection. And you'll see it's a portrait of Zenkala-Šá, who was also known as Gertrude Simmons Bonnin. And that was her missionary and then her married name. And she was a pioneering activist in a generation of American Indians who had graduated from missionary and government schools and gone on to become activists for Indian rights. So we'll learn a little bit more about her background in just a moment, but I'd like to start with a close looking. So let's take a few moments to look closely at this portrait, and I'd like you to use the chat to share what strikes you about this portrait. And as you're looking closely, take notice of her pose, her expression, her clothing. You might also have some thoughts about the quality of the photograph itself as an object or as an artistic medium. Okay, we're seeing some interesting comments here. Kaya, do you want to share with us some of what people are sharing?
Sure, Vanessa. Many people seem to have taken note that she seems confident, but she also looks somewhat relaxed. They mentioned that she does not seem to be looking directly into the camera. Some people have taken note of how she's dressed. One person noted that looks like a Victorian dress with beaded jewelry. Another person made reference again to the layering of beads. Her strength, she seems to be strong and relaxed at the same time, which is kind of unexpected. That the photo also seems to be posed or staged. That she looks beautiful, full of dignity. She's another person again made note to how she's not looking directly at the photographer, but she still is instilling confidence in the photo.
Thank you, Kaya. Wow, you all have made some really astute observations and also spot on. I'm going to ask you now, Mandy, do you have any other observations that you'd like to share? Any things that you've noticed that hasn't come up in the chat?
Well, yeah, hearing some of those observations are the same things that I have been thinking about as I look at this photo of her. And I wonder, I do wonder a lot about some of the items that were brought to light, for example, her clothing and her dress. I see definitely influence of like European dress and style, but also indigenous dress. So if you look closely, around around her waist, I think that it's a blanket, a trade blanket. And in the late 1800s, it was really popular for Native women to make dresses out of this wool cloth. There was a shift from using like deer skin to make dresses to wool because those things were acquired through trade. Same with the beads around her neck. I mean, I would assume that they're glass beads. All of those glass beads came to the Americas through trade with Europeans. Although I question if I wonder if that necklace has anything to do with her culture and heritage, or more is it stylistic, or is it a nod to that? Just because I'm not very familiar with seeing that kind of layering of beads in traditional dress at the time, in the late 1800s. It was not quite, I wouldn't say like every day you wouldn't see a Native woman wearing that many beads in that manner. So I wonder a lot about were these her choices that she made to pose for this picture, her choices in terms of her clothing, her jewelry, or was there some direction that was given by the artist, even with the pose? And I'm very curious about what she's holding in her hand. And it looks like a piece of paper. And I wonder if it had to do with, you know, her writing, music. These are things I know about her, but I just wonder about in the photograph.
Yeah, that's great, Mandy. Yeah, I have a lot of the same questions, and you know, so did people in the chat. And I think, you know, what we're seeing is that the closer we look, the more we notice, the more we have questions, and the more we wonder. And so I'm going to say, let's hold on to these questions for a few minutes, because what I'd like to do now is share with everyone a little bit more about Zenkala-Šá, a little bit about her background and sort of her evolution as an activist. And then we'll come back to the photograph and try to answer some of those questions. So Zenkala-Šá, whose name means red bird, was born on the Yankton Reservation in South Dakota in 1876. And when she was 8 years old, she was sent against her mother's wishes to a Quaker missionary school in the Indian Manual Labor Institute. Yes, and which was one of many boarding schools founded in the 19th century. Not only to educate American Indian children, but also to, as we have learned, to assimilate them into white Christian culture. There, she was given the name of Gertrude Simmons. She enjoyed learning to read, write, play violin, but she resented being forced to pray and to cut her hair, and she grieved the loss of her own culture. And all of those feelings she chronicled in her autobiographical story called The School Days of an Indian Girl. Zincala-Šá's formative experiences at Indian boarding schools and her growing political consciousness of her ethnicity and gender set the stage for her later activism. After graduating from Indiana boarding school and giving a commencement speech on women's rights, Zenkala-Šá attended Earlham College and the New England Conservatory of Music. She was then hired to teach music at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, which we just heard about. However, she was fired from that job within just a couple of years for writing an article for Harper's Monthly that criticized the school's policies of forced assimilation. She returned to the Yankton Reservation, where she began collecting and publishing traditional Dakota stories. And her first book, Old Indian Stories, was published in 1901. Meanwhile, she worked as a clerk for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, where she met and then married U.S. Army Captain Raymond Bonan, who was also of Dakota descent. The Bureau of Indian Affairs assigned Captain Bonan to a reservation in Utah, where the couple lived and worked for the next 14 years. While they were in Utah, Zenkala-Šá continued her cultural and political advocacy work. In 1910, she wrote the libretto for the first American Indian opera, the Sundance Opera, which was based on a sacred Sioux ritual that had been banned by the US government. It was co-written by composer William Hanson, who was a professor at Brigham Young University, and it premiered in Utah to critical acclaim in 1913. Zenkala-Šá joined the Society of American Indians, an organization founded in 1911 with the twin goals of preserving American Indian cultures and advocating for their full citizenship, US citizenship rights. She became the secretary of the SIA in 1916. Both she and her husband became increasingly outspoken critics of the BIA's assimilation policies, and as a result, the BIA dismissed Captain Bonan in 1916, and the family then moved to Washington, D.C., where they continued working on behalf of American Indian cultural sovereignty and citizenship rights. Zitkála-Šá became the editor of the SIA's journal, and she frequently wrote about American Indian issues for high-profile national magazines such as Harper's and The Atlantic. In 1924, Congress passed the Indian Citizenship Act, which granted full US citizenship rights to all American Indians. And although the act represented a major legal milestone, it did not guarantee equality in practice. For one thing, states retained the authority to determine who could or who could not vote, meaning that many states continued to restrict American Indian suffrage. As a result, in 1926, Zincala-Šá and Captain Bonan founded the National Council of American Indians, which played a leading role in advocating for all Indians' right to vote. Serving as the council's first president, Zenkala-Šá organized voter registration drives and gave speeches across the country. A longtime advocate of women's suffrage, she specifically campaigned for American Indian women's right to vote. Additionally, formal citizenship rights did not necessarily affect American Indians' economic status. In 1924, the same year that the Indian Citizenship Act became law, Zincala-Šá co-authored an article that exposed how oil interests exploited and defrauded American Indians for accesses to resource-rich land. The article led to federal investigations and reforms, and this in turn led to the passage of the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, which promoted tribal self-government and gave tribal governments greater sovereignty, over their lands. Until her death in 1938, at the age of 61, Zincala-Šá served as president of the National Council of American Indians while continuing to work for improvements in education, healthcare, and legal recognition of Native Americans, as well as the preservation of Native American culture. So, with her biography as a context, let's go back to the photograph. So the photograph was created in 1898, so that means she would have been 22 years old, and she was teaching at the Carlisle Indian School at that time. So at this point, Mandy and I are going to have a discussion to try to explore some of these questions that we have and that you all have. And, just keeping in mind that we don't have all the answers. Some of these things we can just speculate. But let's go back to this question about, a question came up about her sense of agency, right? So in terms of her clothing and her pose and her expression, the way that she appears in the image, we can wonder how much agency or control did she have over that image? Did she pose herself? Did the photographer, Joseph Kiley, did he direct her? Did he have a say about what she wore? Did she select what she wore? Do you have any thoughts about that initially, Mandy?
Sure. I think, when I look at this, I imagine that she did have agency over this image or this photograph, and even the choice to be the subject of it. I think, there, at this point in time, I think that Native people knew the power of this imagery and even made choices in how they presented themselves to the outside world, in an outside public. Even Sitting Bull signed autographs and sold them when he was touring in Wild West shows. So this wasn't that new of in terms of this era that they're all living in. But I think there probably were intentional choices that she made. And of course, I'm speculating, but it's a unique image. It doesn't look really staged as some others, had in the past. There's definitely artistic expression here, probably both on behalf of her and the photographer. But those are just my thoughts as I, think about her at this time in her life. She's already speaking out against, these issues that she has personally experienced. And I think, a big part of advocacy is she's looking for allies and people who will hear her and listen to her, to join this cause, to create change. So those are kind of my thoughts or my impressions.
Yeah, those are great points you make. And I think that, I think for Native American women in this period, it was really tricky, right? Because they were perceived to be, all Native Americans, as by the dominant Euro-American culture, to be this quote unquote vanishing culture, right? So on the one hand, people were curious, and she felt like she had to present herself as Indian. But if she did that, then she might not be taken seriously by the dominant white culture. But if she appeared too white or too Western, then she wouldn't be perceived as Native American either, or as quote unquote authentic. So it was like this fine line that people, or that activists, were straddling, right? And I think you're absolutely right that they really, she understood very early on the power of photography, because there was a precedent. Photographs were being taken of Native Americans since the mid 1800s, right? And so, as you said, how do you find a voice in this context of the dominant culture? I just noticed a comment here. My impression is that the poise reminds me of a Victorian romantic style. That's interesting, because I like that comment, because she does seem very poised. She seems very self-confident, I think, in the way that she's, reclining, and she sort of has this wistful look about her. She gazes off to the side and she touches her hair. I find that it has almost a sensual quality to it. And, we know that she, now having heard a bit more about her biography, that she was a courageous, powerful, and brilliant woman. So I think she, at this point, was already developing a strong sense of who she was. And I agree. I think she probably had as much agency as she could. I don't know more in my research. I wasn't able to find out more specifically about, for example, there aren't any letters, as far as I know, between that maybe the photographer wrote about the sitting with her. So I don't know the details about how this came about, specifically. Yeah, any other thoughts about her clothing? Mandy, you had mentioned, I think you had mentioned about the wool cloths, and you felt that maybe her dress was a wool cloth that she had wrapped around her waist, and that there was a reference to Native American clothing with that, correct?
Yeah, the wool. Yeah, the I can definitely see in the in her clothing that this influences of Native style, or you could say Native fashion of
Yeah.
the day, right? Because Native people were adapting all the time to um, either the materials or styles, all around them. I mean, that's very true today as well. And so there were just different adaptations that were being made and as new materials arrived. But that wool blanket, you can see in so many different images of Native people at the time. So I think it is, probably this nod or reference to her indigenous culture, as probably the beads are, even though I'm not quite sure if that was like just a style choice or if it is drawing off a specific tradition. But yeah, it's definitely a really beautiful portrait of her.
Yeah, it is. And I think, I also think that she's sort of emphatically stating, I don't have to be one or the other, by combining some Western elements. I think in particular with her blouse, and her more, elements of her heritage, because we do know that later, as she developed her activism, she did have this philosophy of pan-Indianness, of Indians and of all different cultural backgrounds coming together to fight for their rights. And so, I think that she was trying to make a statement that she didn't have to be one or the other. And we do know that later on, during her time in Washington, there are photographs of her where she is wearing a traditional buckskin dress. And she apparently called this her calling card because she knew that it was a way to get the strategy of highlighting her Indianness was a way to get attention for her to be heard. But then once she got a space to speak, then she challenged people's assumptions about, what she might say, because she didn't talk about the past. She talked about the present and about the challenges that her communities were facing. So it's like she used it as a way to get her foot in the door so that she could then speak.
Yeah, I'm smiling because that just made me think of my own personal experience, a place where I used to work where we had to wear traditional dress.
Huh.
And you did have this whole experience of, people seeing you not as a person standing right in front of them, but as almost like a relic of the
Yeah.
past. But yet you could use that to get across, the point that you wanted to make about, and for me, Lakota culture and history and tradition, and also, contemporary issues. So it's been happening for a really long time still today. So
Yeah.
today just made me think of that.
No, I
But
love that. I love how you're bringing it back to the present, and I think what's so wonderful about this portrait is it really shows us how savvy Zitkála-Šá and other contemporary activists were.
Yeah, and there were two comments I saw in the chat that I really liked. One said I sense an attitude of defiance,
Yeah.
and another that said she looks impatient with the moment at the time, or the moment of the time. So
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I really like those comments.
Yeah, thank you. So so let's explore another I think important question around this photograph. And let's go back to the photograph because I am aware of the time as well, but which is, what was the photographer's intent with the portrait? We've talked a little bit now about Zincala-Šá, but was the photographer Joseph Kiley, was he trying to document Zincala-Šá, or an example of a Native American woman, or was he trying to idealize or romanticize her? I think it's an interesting question. And just to share that Joseph Kiley was a part-time photographer. He was also a lawyer, and he was associated with other well-known art photographers of the time, like Alfred Stieglitz and Gertrude Caspier, who someone mentioned in the chat, who also took photographs of Zincala-Šá. And these artists or photographers were interested in the artistic capabilities of photography. And so this photograph was created using a particular process called the platinum printing process, which had just been developed during this period in the latter part of the 1800s. And one of the characteristics of this printing method is that it created a softer effect than the silver print, which is what had been used before then in the more in the middle part of the 19th century, excuse me. And so those photographs from the 1850s, that where photographers were trying to document the so-called vanishing race, this photograph and others like it are different. And they're different in the way that they seem to me, this one seems to be less about trying to document and much more about idealizing or romanticizing. If you look closely, you can notice the sort of soft, luminous effect of the photograph. And, here we have this image of a very beautiful young or youthful Native woman. And as we stated, she's relaxing in this sort of central pose. So it's really the opposite of the more precise photographs that you'll find from an earlier period using this silver printing process. And what I think is so interesting about this is that, this photograph was taken at the, coincided with the peak of the real physical and cultural devastation of American Indian nations. So it really belies what was really happening historically during this time. And I find that really, really interesting. It's just this very painful juxtaposition of what really was happening and what's being presented in this photograph. Yeah, Mandy, do you have any other anything to add to that?
No, I mean, just it's important to acknowledge what you just said, with these images of this era, what was happening at the time, and, in the background of the cultural erasure and assimilation policy, great poverty on reservations. This early reservation era was probably one of the most challenging times in history for Indigenous peoples. It's also the lowest point in just even population at the time. The Indian population had been decimated. And so, it's an interesting way to think about the juxtaposition of this imagery and the photographers and what they're capturing in the reality of the times.
Yeah, thank you. Mandy, I'm just noticing the time. We're sort of creeping up, and I'm wondering if I just want to make sure that we get a chance to, talk about the connection between these two objects. So let's go back to our opening question and revisit, taking into account everything we've spoken about. What do these objects tell us about the connection between a desire for recognition of one's culture and activism for equity? Please share your thoughts in the chat. And Kaya, when you see things come in, feel free to share.
So nothing has come through yet. Okay, we're getting one. So someone commented, sometimes these two causes overlap.
Yeah.
Which totally makes sense. Let's see.
So I'm thinking that, I think that in terms of a desire for recognition of one's culture, I think that in the case of Zincala-Šá, it's her lived experience, right? That really prompted her to, I think that in combination with her natural talents and gifts as a writer and as a speaker and as a thinker, pushed her to become an activist. I think oftentimes our own personal experiences, which are so much more visceral, right, than when we hear about something about someone else, is really what can push us to want to become involved.
Yeah, and I see one of these comments in the chat that today we hear representation matters and having control over one's own narrative and identity is a kind of activism. I think that's such a really, powerful statement, and one, since the time of Zenkala-Šá, Native peoples have been really just trying to be heard and say, that representation does really matter, especially in the face of this kind of cultural erasure. Native people experienced that accurate representation, and individuals representing themselves as they truly are is so important.
Yes, definitely. So, Mandy, do you think we have a moment, a bit of time for you to talk about a little bit of the legacy of these policies that we've been discussing?
Yeah, so I did want to just go back to those, the two objects next to one another to talk about this legacy and what it means today. The legacy of boarding schools is very conflicted. Children who attended them experienced harsh punishments. They endured isolation, physical and sexual abuse. Many lost their abilities to communicate with their families once they lost their language. As adults, they face the inability to parent or to show affection to their own children. Experience substance abuse, post-traumatic stress disorder, and all of that, has led to intergenerational trauma passed down from one generation to the next. And many children did not survive that experience or even ever get to return to their families. And so, there are still negative impacts felt today from the boarding school experience. For some who had those experiences, that carried on into future generations, and the results of that today are, the fact that only 7% of Native students graduate from high school, compared with 75% of the total population. Only 9.3% of Native Americans earn a college degree, compared with the national average of 20%. So, there's still inequity there as a result. But there are also, in the case of Zincala-Šá, she was an outspoken opponent of Indian boarding schools because of her personal experience. And she spoke out in various ways through her writing, through speaking, and her, like many of her peers who also experienced, the boarding school environment and lived through it, went on to advocate against these harmful types of assimilation policies. And you see, as a result of that advocacy, beginning in that generation, in the 20th century, we begin to see change. We begin to see tribal nations taking back agency in education. And there are various different models of that at work today. One example is Indigenous language immersion schools. And these schools systematically incorporate Native cultural content, that's culturally appropriate, and culturally appropriate ways of teaching and learning. And most importantly, these Native language immersion schools not only engage students in learning their native language, but also, math, science, social studies, music, art, and even English. And so we've continued to see this advocacy for policy change in our public schools to build a more inclusive education for all. And there are certain states that have passed actual legislation. Montana was the first, in which every child who attends public school will learn this history of the Indigenous communities in which those schools are located. And our museum has also launched a national education initiative called Native Knowledge 360, which is aimed at transforming teaching and learning about American Indians through culturally relevant and appropriate educational resources for educators and professional development. So I know there's, these lasting legacies of boarding schools, but also the work to make positive change is still continuing today. So I know we're just about out of time, but we did want to, take some audience questions if the audience has time to stay with us and has additional questions you'd like Vanessa and I to address. We'll take a few moments to answer some of those questions.
So Amy just put a note in the chat, because there weren't actually any questions in the Q&A, that because of time, we're going to skip the Q&A. And I think, well, there's a question here. Well, let's just answer this one question, and then we'll close with our closing question. But someone is curious to know why do we think that, based on her own experience, that she went back and taught at a boarding school?
Based on Zenkala-Šá's experience, why did she
based
teach
on
at a boarding school?
Yeah.
This is an assumption. However, I think, experienced it at an early age. Um, and education, the kind of education she received, probably opened doors for her that she maybe didn't anticipate. And if you think about careers for women at the time, teaching was probably one of the number one things that women went into. Um, but it's hard for me to answer for Zincala-Šá, but I can just give a personal example. My grandfather's side of the family, his mom and sister attended industrial school in Canada, which is similar, but not everybody had a negative experiences, and many people found, that they appreciated the education that they received. And in my family, that translated down to the encouragement to, get good grades and to go to college and get a college degree. And so, I'm just assuming that, her education opened some of those doors for her. But then, as many of us, as we become more informed and gain more education, realize the errors of some of the systems and structures under which we live. And so that's just my complete assumption because I don't know specifically the answer. But
No, it makes total sense. I think that was one of the things that was interesting for me to learn, when I was doing research, is that it's a complicated issue, and that like in the case of Zincala-Šá, there were aspects of boarding school that she liked. She loved learning. She loved being able to learn instruments. So it wasn't all negative. I wonder if she maybe felt as a young woman that by teaching there, she could change things. I don't know if she had a certain idealism, and then once she was there, she realized that there was nothing she could do, or that she could change things in a different way by being an activist. So I think let's close so we can be respectful to everyone's time. I think what I'd like for you to ask just to yourself, as you leave this program is, what's resonated for you, and is there anything in your thinking around these issues that's shifted as a result of joining us today? So Mandy and I would like to thank you so much for joining us today, and we have another In Dialogue program coming up on May 13th. So a reminder, these programs are offered every month, and I see that my colleague has posted the Eventbrite link in the chat so that you can sign on, and we hope to see you again. And thank you very much.